thank you, first of all, to the Rosalind Franklin Society for existing, but also for inviting me to be part of such an esteemed, incredible group of speakers and attendees. So I'm really excited about this. And I gave this, very lofty title for this talk with the idea that I was going to talk about how you can use your science through entrepreneurship and creating new companies, get your science out in the world and do more in that way. And I will talk about that, as well as the federal resources that are available to you to help you get your science out there in the world. But I actually also then decided, maybe it's somewhat useful to talk a little bit about my own path in this sense, and share some of the insights from the incredible places I've really had the privilege of being able to be part of. So I'm gonna just start with, kind of my goal here is to leave here for me with a bunch of allies in creating a more inclusive innovation ecosystem. And so with that, I'm gonna try to arm you with a little bit of knowledge and maybe a different perspective about how you can get engaged. What I would really like is also to get some feedback from you. I want to hear from you about your ideas, the barriers you've encountered that maybe I might be able to have some sort of ability to have a sphere of influence and change from where I am. And then leave here with, how can we work together? How do we keep this connection going and leave together here to do this? And I do tend to prefer having conversations. So I think I'm gonna try to watch the clock and leave enough time for us to have a conversation and just give sort of some highlights. And then I just want to hear what you actually want to know. So I'm going to cover 2 tracks of how you can activate your superhero powers instead of just the one. So entrepreneurship, definitely going to cover that. But the other is around science policy, which I've had the great privilege of being able to do science policy or policy for science entrepreneurship. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that. And the first thing is just that I got into science because I wanted to have the most positive impact I possibly could and help as many people as I could. And I felt like science was that path. That, and then when I was 7 years old, I played this video game where you're a surgeon. And every time I played, I would just see my patient's toe tag and hear dun, 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 dun. Wait, I was just going with the death march, but the funeral march song, right? So that left a pretty deep impression on me that I probably should not be operating on people. So I went to grad school, and I grew up in very entrepreneurial environments academically. Startups were really just part of the lifeblood of MIT, of Stanford. It's just in the air. And it's interesting, though, because growing up academically in the biologist realm, right, I still had this impression of industry sort of being antithetical to the purity of academic research. And so, I was quite resistant to business. I thought it was terrible. Business is terrible. But at the end of my PhD, I wasn't actually entirely sure where I wanted to go and how best to use my science to I still wanted to have that amazing impact that I got into science for. And like Tracy brought up, alternative careers are not really alternative careers, but the ones that were presented to biologists at this point, I could go into consulting, I could work in intellectual property, or I could go and keep doing research, but in industry. And I wasn't entirely sure where I wanted to go at that point, but there was a postdoc in the lab that I was working in who had done a science policy fellowship and thought, he knew that I was very interested in science outreach and communication efforts and thought maybe that might be something I'd be interested in. And I hate politics, to be honest, and I had no idea. I'd never heard of science policy, didn't know what it meant. But he convinced me, there was a science policy fellowship at the National Academy of Sciences, the Mirzayan Graduate Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. It's only 3 months long. And I was like, well, after a PhD, 3 months is nothing, right? You can do anything for 3 months. Like, okay, I'll go check out DC. And that was probably the most life-changing decision I ever made. I got to work at the Koshland Science Museum, which is pretty much a science policy museum for the National Academy of Sciences. And it just completely opened up this whole world of possibilities I had never heard of before, where you can actually use your science in ways that don't just mean you're saving the world from the bench or you're going to save the world from a company. And so I was sort of addicted to this learning about all of these new things that I'd never thought of before and how the government is actually involved in creating the systems and the structure that I'd been working in. So I actually had been working also at a startup at the time, and somebody came and gave a talk about the Small Business Innovation Research Program, SBIR. How many of you have ever heard of that acronym, SBIR? Wow, well, this is very exciting. So for those of you who don't know, I'm going to talk a lot more about it, but SBIR is essentially America's seed fund. The government gives money to startup companies. And I was being at a startup, I had never heard this before, right? I've been in Silicon Valley. The only thing we heard about how to raise money for our startup was getting VC funding. I hadn't even really heard about angel capital funding, but it was just really all about the venture capital. And so I followed up with that person, and just kind of the confluence of things decided actually it'd be a lot more interesting to work on the side that has the money instead of actually applying for the grant. So instead of applying for the grant, I applied for the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, and then ended up working at the National Cancer Institute Small Business Innovation Research Development Center, SBIR. So I got to be on the money side, which is definitely a better place to be. But that was the really eye-opening path, I would say, for me and for SBIR. So let me just, excellent, okay, SBIR. So let me talk a little bit about SBIR. So I saw a lot of hands. People know generally about it, but let me also just, for those of you who hadn't heard about it before, give you just sort of a brief overview. Happy to answer any more questions you might have about it. So SBIR, America's Seed Fund, it's about $3.2 billion every year that goes to support early stage companies that are doing research and development. So this is any federal agency that you could think of that funds science. The Department of Defense, the National Institutes of Health, the FDA, the Department of Energy, NASA, USDA, of course, the National Science Foundation. There are 11 different departments and agencies that have to reserve a portion of their R&D budget to go to small businesses to fund that R&D. And so this is really, we call it the seed fund because this is typically the earliest stage funding that a company has in being able to prove out their technology and get to a point where eventually they can get venture capital funding, for example. And so it's been around since 1982 in essentially the same structure. So this is sort of tranche funding. you can get an initial phase 1 grant or contract, depending on the agency, for about somewhere between $50,000 to $250,000, and this is kind of a proof of concept type of grant. Once you pass that, you can apply for phase 2, which is generally about $1.6 million, and do further R&D. And then the magical step of commercialization happens, where now your research is ready to just get out onto the marketplace or transition into a government program. So get onto like a NASA spaceship or into a warfighter's like vest to protect them. And of course, there's a much longer process than the 2 years or so that you might get this funding, but that's kind of what we really work on, and something that I've been so excited and to be part of, because the people that work on the SBIR and STTR program within the government across all of these different federal agencies are so passionate about trying to help all of the scientists and engineers and innovators that we fund just make it and get your science out into the world. So I started off at the National Cancer Institute, and then after my fellowship, they hired me, I stayed on, and I then eventually moved to the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, kind of covering their small business programs. And then a couple years ago now, I guess 3 years ago now, I moved to the Small Business Administration. And so let me tell you a little bit about the small business. Well, okay, first, let me tell you a little more about SBIR, just to make it a little bit more concrete. So some of you I know have SBIR awards. Can you raise your hand and just like people look around? Okay, I see one over there. You're gonna hear from a speaker who has one too from later. But it's in addition to some of these big name companies that you might recognize, right, that have had some incredible impacts with their transformative technology in the world. As I said, the company's been around, or the program, the SBIR program, has been around since 1982. So Symantec and Qualcomm, that was when they were young, they got some initial funding from the National Science Foundation, and now they're everywhere, right? But so part of why we work on this program, why does the government actually fund research for companies, is to be able to get that R&D out there in the world into the products that are making a big difference. I mean, Illumina also had some early SBIR funding to develop that technology that now is like in everybody's labs, right? And so it's both getting that technology out in the world, but it's also the entrepreneurs, the innovators that are involved. Okay? We care about making sure that your research is meeting the missions of all of these different federal agencies that are involved, and also that all of the investment, so I mentioned this $3.2 billion going through the SBIR program, but that's only 3%, about 3% of the R&D that is funded by the federal government. So every year, the federal government spends about $150 billion in research and development. And how do we make sure that all of that fundamental research that gets funded can continue to support the overall scientific enterprise, as well as having some of that applied use? And again, kind of something that Tracy mentioned in her talk, kind of the getting to the science and technology also that gets directly out and used in the market. So, so the SBA. So how did I end up at the Small Business Administration? First, let me tell you a little bit about the Small Business Administration, SBA, because I didn't really know that much about it before I started working there. But its mission is to help America and Americans start, grow, and build businesses. And most of the businesses actually that SBA serves are really the businesses you think of and you see and use hopefully every day. Those Main Street businesses, from breweries, barber shops, anything, kind of accounting. It serves all types of businesses and does this through counseling. There are, across the entire country, many resource partners that provide direct advice on how do you develop a business plan? What do you have to do to set up an accounting system? What are the rules and registrations for that? Access to capital. So there are also SBA, and the federal government actually guarantees loans through banks, especially for, so to make sure that those banks are willing to take a risk on somebody who wants to start a business that the bank is a little bit iffy about. The SBA and the federal government will try to back that loan and say, we want you to take that risk and go forward. And contracting. So the federal government is the biggest possible customer probably in the world with the US federal government. And so there are a lot of federal contracts, opportunities to provide services and goods to the federal government. And so the SBA is there to ensure that all of the agencies are actually providing opportunities to have the government as a customer for new and small businesses. And then something that you may not have heard about, but the SBA is actually also involved very deeply in disaster recovery, not just for businesses, but also for people who are affected by disasters. So during the hurricanes, for example, SBA gives out direct loans to people to kind of recover their homes, kind of the next line after FEMA. So why and how is the SBA involved in SBIR? Like, where's the research, right? SBA does not actually have any funding for research and development. We don't give out any SBIR awards. So how is SBA involved? We set the policies and really coordinate across all of those different agencies and departments to help them make sure, one, that they are going to maximize their use of this SBIR program. So this is a requirement for those agencies. So I will say, so this role that I've had in being able to coordinate across all the agencies for the SBIR program has actually led to a pretty amazing opportunity the last year and a half. And so I worked at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy as the Assistant Director for Entrepreneurship. And so let me answer one question that comes to people's minds very frequently for OSTP these days and working for the White House. Yes, there are people working at the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. It's about 65, 70 people, which is the same size actually of an OSTP as there was during the Clinton and Bush administrations. So yes, people turn over during different administrations, but OSTP does have a director now. He was confirmed last year, Dr. Kelvin Drogemeyer, and he's fantastic to work for. And so I want to say, there is actually really great work being done at the White House in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and specifically work that supports the mission of the Rosalind Franklin Society and all the things that we care about right now, which is promoting opportunities for women, for people who are underrepresented in the sciences. And so I really want to encourage you all to work with OSTP right now. And so let me just tell you a few of those things. So one thing though about OSTP is just the mission of OSTP is to ensure that America is the world leader in science and technology. And so it does this by unleashing discovery and innovation, building a workforce for the future, and advancing American values in science and technology globally. And so kind of the way that OSTP thinks about American values is that they are very well aligned with scientific values: openness, transparency, fairness. And so being able to protect American investments in research while still maintaining the necessary openness and international flavor of the scientific enterprise is something that we're working very hard on. The other one of the specific pieces around unleashing or building the workforce of the future, have any of you seen, or last December, the 5-year federal STEM education plan, strategic plan was released. So a few of you have seen it. So something that is core to this across the entire federal government is the ensuring that one of the core principles explicitly laid out there is ensuring that there is diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM education, and that all Americans have access to good STEM education regardless of where they are or who they are. And then finally, on unleashing discovery and innovation, the Dr. Drogemeyer, the director of OSTP, created a whole new joint committee on the research environment. So this is something that is covering some very high priority items for him. And two of those things, it's really about making sure that the research environment is a good one to work in. And so two of those things that I think will hit particularly close to home, one is reducing administrative burden. Why we make scientists do, we keep them from doing the thing that you need to do, right? The research, the innovation, because of all of the administrative requirements that come with federal money. So we're working hard on reducing that. And then the second, and I think you'll hear a lot more about this from the National Academy side, is how the federal government can create more safe and inclusive research environments. So that's something that OSTP is convening across the entire federal government, all the agencies, to really discuss how, as funders, you can use that leverage to ensure that the research environments are safe and inclusive for everyone to be able to participate in research. And then on the unleashing innovation side, I'll come back to now. So I just recently returned back to SBA. That's also, I don't have business cards, but my contact information is pretty easy to find. Also still at OSTP, they're a leader in this lab to market cross-agency priority goal. And so that's what I was primarily focused on while I was there, is trying to convene across the entire federal government, what can we be doing to make sure that $150 billion R&D investment gets translated into the products and services and companies that are gonna make a meaningful difference in all of our lives. So this also brings me back to what I'm doing still at SBA to create that inclusive innovation ecosystem that I want you all to be part of and to tell me how. So I'm just gonna mention a few quick things that we're focused on right now. One is working very closely with the National Women's Business Council on studying, what the issues are for how we get more women in the SBIR program. I will say that, I've spent a lot of years kind of throughout my entire career with the SBIR program trying to understand what the issues are and figuring out where, what kinds of programs we can look at. But of course, I think, as Terry mentioned, right, there is definitely, we can do some things right now, but we also need to do big systemic change. Okay, so I'm gonna mention two more things. So one is just that agencies are also doing a lot in this area, creating programs, for example, applicant assistance programs that are specifically focused on people who haven't been participating in the SBIR programs. But the reason I show this is because we want to connect up that innovation ecosystem network, breaking down silos between those who have been participating in innovation and entrepreneurship and those who should be, because all Americans, we can't solve the world's hardest problems if we don't have everyone engaged. And so I will end it here. I don't know, is there any time for questions? No, okay, sorry. All right, well, I'll just chat with you, but then, so my contact information is there, but I do just wanna say, I don't know if everybody's seen this video, but this is like one of my favorite ones from like a number of years ago. I'm really looking forward to the day when we don't need to qualify scientist or entrepreneur with the word female. And as my favorite, 7th grade rapper representing Rosalind Franklin says, I'm not a female scientist, I'm a scientist. Yeah. But I highly recommend this rap, it's very good. So maybe during the break.